Hello, everyone, and welcome to Azure Management Talk series. In this series, we are going to talk with a few Azure MVPs as well as community champions and get them to share some of their experiences from the field, maybe some use cases, as well as some tips and tricks. The topic for today is 5 easy steps to apply financial management to your cloud budget, which is being presented by Cameron and Tony. I will let you guys introduce yourself. So without further ado, I think let's just get straight into it. Handing over to you guys.
All right. So first off, as way of self-introduction, my name is Cameron Fuller. I'm a cloud and data center management MVP now for the last 14 years. So all things cloud are very much core to my heart. I come from a background of SCOM, which explains a lot of the history I've got here with SquaredUp as well. So I've worked with their product lines on the Azure side now, as well as historically on the SCOM side of things, and now working with Tony and his team around Azure. So I would like to also introduce Tony Nguyen. So Tony and I have worked together for, I think we discussed this recently, over 20 years now. Almost consecutive at this point in time. Tony's got a really interesting background. So Tony comes from an application development perspective. So he's got an app dev perspective of the world, and then he spent a lot of time now working in Azure and becoming a subject matter expert in that space for our customers. So brings a really rounded set of experience I think will be very beneficial today.
Cool.
So with just a quick round of introduction in terms of what we're going to cover, there are 5 major topics that we're going to talk about today, as are listed here. And what I'm gonna mention here just is a little bit, sometimes when you get into these calls, you learn a little bit more about your presenter. So both Tony and I have been through similar financial perspectives on things. Both of us actually have gone through Dave Ramsey Financial Peace University and worked through that type of deal. And I found a quote from him that I thought was really relevant today. It says, "A budget is telling your money where to go instead of wondering where it went." So I think the same thing applies when you're talking about this in Azure. We've heard plenty of experiences with customers where they've been on that second half of the equation, wondering where it went. When you get that surprising bill that comes through and the rest of it. And this session is really helping, or should be designed to help you identify where, not even where it went, but also to figure out where you want it to go. That's key to what we're talking about. Tony, do you want to introduce us to these 5 concepts and kind of walk us through,
Sure.
where you're at with this?
Yeah. So one of the key things we've learned is that over the last 5-6 years, as we've managed some of our customer environment, try to manage costs. So initially, cost management was a big to-do thing. There's a lot of rigors, a lot of process, and what we find that a lot of our customers are not able to follow those process, be basically disciplined to manage their budget. And so as we begin to kind of fine tune that, we find out basically is that, you keep things simple, make it like a personal finance type of model. How do you manage your bank account? Where do you want to spend your money? How do you know? What's your budgeting process look like? So we want to be able to kind of reduce that down to a very small, tangible set of things that is easy to do. Take a couple minutes a day. Maybe a couple 30 minutes a week, so forth. So this is basically the process we came up with. Again, it's we want to be able to perform quickly, but with purpose and rhythms. That's the key piece of it. And then we'll walk through that with you guys and show you guys how we able to kind of rein in control of some of our customer environment that has not have the rigors of cost management. One of the key benefit of doing this is predictable costs, right? So if you look at our organization, one of the challenges they have with Azure, with cloud in general, is that I don't know what my next month bill look like. I don't know what my whole budget is for the year, right? And it's kind of haphazard guessing. And so our goal is to begin to put a process in place that can, reliably, not 100%, but at least 80–90% sure that, hey, we believe your annual budget should be this. And then we kind of, control that on a monthly basis.
Excellent. And I think you're going to show us the fact that budgeting for Azure is just as much fun as home budgeting, right? Because everyone loves running a home budget.
Well, actually, I like budgeting. Like I look at my bank account every day. It's been 1 minute. Open it up, look at that, look at my credit card, see what my wife has spent last night, and that's it.
Awesome. Well, Tony, we have a difference of perspective on that. I think that's I think we're the two different types of personalities on that one. So, but I'm glad that you've got that role. So here's our agenda, the 5 core pieces that we're going to talk about here. So budgeting, cost analysis, cost review, cost planning, and then goals and objectives. So those are the 5 that we're looking at.
Yeah. And also
so
remember,
okay.
This is a process, right? It's a circular process. So it's not like you're done budgeting, you're good for a year. It's not going to work that way. You have to revisit it on a regular basis.
Okay, so from a SCOM perspective, it's not just enough for me to set an alert telling me, hey, if this is going above my threshold, send me an alert. That's not going to be sufficient anymore?
It is within some timeline, like within that month. But then every month you may want to revisit that because things have changed. People add more stuff. Microsoft provide stuff that could increase or decrease your costs on a monthly basis.
Okay, good to know. All right, well, let's get into it. So we're starting with the first thing with budgeting. So establishing a budget. So why do we want to set a budget? I mean, you and I obviously, have home budgets and the rest. We can see the benefit to that. I've seen situations where we had a customer that we both know of, that we work with that got a surprising bill, a very surprising bill, because something had occurred within their environment. They weren't tracking on a regular basis. And I think it was like the customer in question, I think it was like a $12,000 bill, if you know the one I'm talking about, Tony.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it was caused because of a mistake. And transparently, it was an expensive lesson to have to learn to figure out, how do you look and identify those situations? That's what happens if you don't establish the budget and you're not tracking these types of things, is these surprising situations. So talk to us some about budgeting, Tony, and why and what we're doing.
Well, basically before you do any cost management, you have to have established a baseline, right? So that way am I on track or am I off track? What's the track you're on, right? And again, you can have multiple budget based upon the different environment. A good rule of thumb for us, when we work with our customers, that your development in QA, and UAT environment should be about 30% of your entire spend, Azure spend. Surprisingly, that number actually is very, very correct. I've worked with dozens and dozens of environment. That's the target, and it's usually very achievable. And that's usually, it's kind of interesting, mix of, what is your development compared to production. And so that would be basically one budget set. You can go down business units, so forth. But the key piece is that you cannot enforce cost management if you don't have a budget, right? Because you cannot tell the developer, hey, you're spending too much money, and they're going to ask you, well, what's too much, right? And so you got to give them a number. Hey, you got to keep your development environment less than $3,000 a month, right? So once you have established that threshold, you can then basically hold people accountable to it. Without that, then there's no accountability.
And do you establish these types of budgets on a subscription level, or is the goal in essence, to lots and lots of subscriptions or minimum number of subscriptions?
We've done both, right? So basically, though we can have budget post subscription, we also have budget with customer have one subscription. We also have budget within that subscription for different things. Like good example, dev environment is X, QA is Y, production is Z, and then we also have some budget around how much we're willing to pay for log analytics, right? So we actually put a cap on that and says, hey, when I hit certain amount of money, I'm gonna stop stop that service for a while. And so the goal is really basically put a budget where it makes sense to your organization, right?
Okay, no, that makes good sense. So as we start talking about budgeting here, you give us a little bit more detail on this, and I want to talk about one that I spend a lot of time with from a budgeting perspective as well. Go ahead, Tony.
So first, as any cost management, this budget number, right? You must be realistic, right? Right now you're spending, $100,000 a month, and you say, well, I'm going to set a budget of $50,000. That's not going to happen, right? So the goal is basically use the last 3 months of your cost data to define your budget. Again, budget is a baseline, not a goal, right? So the goal is to basically, have an additional thing to do with the budget. But the budget gives you a baseline to start with. You can break down budget, by different spending category, right? It's like, hey, I want to know how much I spend on my disk space. I want to know how much I spend on my CPU and that bandwidth. It's funny, like you look at, Azure, right, the cloud, everything breaks down to really three things, right? The storage, bandwidth, and compute. But there are hundreds and hundreds of ways how to break that down. And that way you guys ever get the bill and see the detail behind it, it doesn't make sense, right? I have customers who get like, there's like 20, 30 pages on the invoices. And it's very tough to track down what is the true cost, where they spend the money. And so that's, the goal is basically is to establish the budget. And that way we didn't know, within each category where things are aligned to.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I had one service that I was responsible for there for several years. In essence, we did a very similar process to what Tony's talking about here, where we identified what our costing was over several months. It was about $700, $800 a month. We knew what was expected. So that gave us the budgeting place to start from. And we didn't leave it there in terms of this is what the amount's going to be from here forward. We're always actively looking at where should we be cutting costs and decreasing the monthly costs associated with it. But setting that budget really gave us an idea of where we should be at and help us to be able to set thresholds to let us know if something had changed, if we had diverted from our normal usage pattern, so that we would be aware of it very quickly. Not as quickly as the way Tony's got this set up, but at least we didn't get hit at the end of the month and with a huge surprise. So take our example here, Tony. What do we got on this one?
Yeah, so here's a good example, right? You look at the last 3 months of the spend, right? You can see, 3 months ago, very little, and then suddenly you got huge spike in the last 2 months. And so you can't just go to the first month. Oh, well, I want to use that as a budget. And so as you look at this one, they're around about $500 to $600 a month. And so the baseline would be, let's start out at $550. And so that would be the baseline goal for this. So that's basically your starting number. And then the goal would be go through the whole process to see if you can improve that numbers. And so the goal is, iteratively try to get that number down to a point where, you feel comfortable with, and then be able to sustain.
Excellent. All right. So what about how we do these configurations within Azure itself? Kind of a little bit more of the step through this.
Yeah. So once you figure out what your budget look like, there is a mechanism in the cost management area that allows you to set budget against specifically the certain scope. You can set the scope against management group, subscription, resource group even, and then set basically a budget on that. They also allow you to do a feature set where you can actually put a budget alert. So in other words, let's say if my budget hit 50%, let me know, right? And so when you get an email notification that says, hey, you have 50% of your budget, and you're like, wait a minute, I've only been 1 week into the month. Then you're completely out of scope. And then that kind of gives you an idea to typically those information go to like the upper management, let them know that, hey, this is what how much we have spent already. Typically for the operation team, we look at them on almost a daily basis. So we don't really depend on the budget alert, but management team like to have that to just that way they know how much we spent.
Yeah, and I'll say a cheap trick I've used on the budget alerts in the past is when you have subscriptions that you have decommissioned but have not deleted yet, I set a budget alert threshold at like 0 or 1, in essence, as low as possible, so that if anything actually is billing within that, we get a quick alert letting us know that we are expecting it shouldn't be billing anymore, but it is. So just a cheap trick that I've used from time to time. All right, so Tony, we've talked about budget. You've won us over to the wonderful world of why we all need to have a budget, both for home and for our Azure or other cloud resources. How is cost analysis different than a budget? I mean, they seem to be really directly related. Help me with this.
Yeah, so budget basically says, how much I'm willing to spend, right? Within some categories and sections and services. Cost analysis, now break that down. So, okay, where did my money go? Last month I paid Microsoft $30,000. Where did it go? What did I spend my money on? Right. So that's basically is what the cost analysis process is to break that down to individual resources, resource type. That way you will know where the money goes.
Okay. Now that makes good sense.
Yeah. And so again, know your spend, establish your baseline, know your value. That's one of the things we talk about in the cloud. Is really is basically is that is value, right? It is what you spend, is that valuable to the organization. What I mean basically is like, I can spend $1,000 on the VM to run some application. If I spend $500 on that VM and still able to run the same application, then I just basically put $500 value back into the organization. So that's basically is the key. So to do that, you really do need to know your resources and services. There are cost management tool out there, management group, break it down to subscription resource group. You can break it down to service type. You look at the tool itself. There's really a lot of ways to slice and dice the data to get you the insight you're looking for. And so typically we do is, we look at service costs, right? Where did you spend your money? So that way you can break down to SQL, VMs, storage, so forth. And a good example, one of our customers just spun up a bot, right? As soon as they spin up a bot, we knew right away because we saw a brand new cost service that came into the dashboard. And so the goal would be basically is make sure you understand what you're spending your money on. And then the next section we'll talk about some of the key pieces to look at.
Okay, so kind of walk me through this, what this looks like in terms of, what is this cost analysis thing showing us?
Right. So this is basically, a provider of Microsoft. You can have capability to change the scope, in terms of, hey, I want to look at the whole subscription. I want to look at a resource group. I want to look at a particular type of resource. You can then basically look at, cost by services. You can actually look at your time slice in terms of, I want to look at this month, last quarter, last year. You can add additional filter in there for tags. So I want to be able to filter out some tag or put in some tag or group by some tag, right? So a good example would be, hey, I want to group by department. So if you tag your resources correctly, you should be able to basically group your costs around that. And then so you can see as, this one, right, it's accumulation, but the different color tell you what type of cost that is. So like the bottom blue, that's basically is our storage cost. So as you can see, it's rising. And then the middle one is, something like app gateway, right? So, a couple of weeks ago, somebody spun up app gateway. You can see the cost begin to rise up there, and now it becomes second in terms of the total cost. And so the whole goal here basically is to really understand where you spend your money, right? So you can see we've got virtual machine, gateway, VPN gateway, security center, and then all the services. And you can also break down by resource group. You can break down by by individual resources also too.
Now, if you do that, let's say you put together something that represents let's say you're in a shared subscription where you have a series of resources that exist in a resource group. How do you save that in essence and come back to it later? Because it's something that once you establish it, you'd want to be able to go back to that easily.
Yeah, so Microsoft does have that. There's a save capability that way it actually save that component. But typically, we recommend go ahead and pin this thing into the dashboard area. So you look at right next to the cost analysis heading, there's a little pin button. So you push on that, it then pop up and allows you to pin this particular dashboard into your dashboard, the Azure dashboard area. That way, from then on, you have a dashboard you can go back to and look at it. And then you click on it, it'll take you back to this particular view with all the right setting. So that's a really easy way to manage, how you want to look at your data and not have to go back and reset all your filters.
Okay, now that makes sense. But also, as we both know, there's a great third-party solution that provides some really good detail on this as well. So SquaredUp, this is an out-of-the-box set of functionality, by the way. So you load up SquaredUp. As long as it's got access, this is a pre-built set of some of the dashboards that are out there. So you're getting the cost overview and cost over time, as well as a breakdown, different types of visualizations from what you're seeing versus Azure dashboards. Just to let people know hands-on in terms of my experiences with this. I've worked a lot with Azure dashboards. I've worked quite a bit now with the SquaredUp Azure pieces as well. Azure dashboards are really challenging to work with in several ways. But one of the big ones I'll mention is publishing dashboards in a current state requires an extremely high level of permissions to be able to do that within a subscription versus something like this within SquaredUp. Where it's separate from that allows you to, as long as you've got access to the reading capabilities, you can build your dashboards, share your dashboards, and the rest of it in a much more fluid method than what's available, in my opinion, from what I've seen within the Azure dashboards. So just as a heads up for everybody here who's unaware or hasn't had a chance to see the SquaredUp pieces of this, they've got some good tech in this area. So they've also got a good breakdown. You can see kind of the tree map or heat map type view down below, cost by resource type breakdown. That's also available within their dashboarding solution. And again, whatever subscriptions, whatever resources you've got pre-built for that. And then if you wanted to make an alteration and say you wanted to scope it to your specific set of resources, very easy again to pin that or save that off, share it as a dashboard, make it available to other people in your organization. So Tony, what's the Azure piece of this that we're seeing also?
Yeah, so again, this is part of the cost analysis. This is basically a breakdown for, hey, in January, this is what my costs look like by individual resources, right? So you can see, and identify the cost associated with that instance of the resource. And so this is really powerful because it tells you basically what you spend your most money on and be able to kind of track that down to see where, why you're spending that much money.
Okay, no, that makes good sense. All right, so another one of the reports or dashboards that's available here, the cost analysis by resource on a daily perspective. What is this and how do we use it and why?
Yeah, so this is, to me, this is one of the most powerful tools because basically it allows me to look at it on a daily basis. In other words, I know what we spent yesterday. And so you can see, if yesterday there's a spike. And so that allows to kind of analyze, okay, why was it spiking? What are we adding to the system? So that basically kind of give you an idea of if somebody add or change something to the system to impact costs, you would know it basically the next day. There are also capability for you to kind of develop some PowerShell script to allow you to know that, hey, there's a 10% delta within my cost today. I'll go ahead and send out alerts. But cost data typically is delay, and so you may not be able to get the new real time. So from our point of view, a day behind is acceptable. But it's really powerful because it tells you that, hey, something got spun up, and you can highlight it and see what was spun up, and then be able to drill down and figure out who did it, and then go track down the party, say, what are you doing, right? That's one thing we do for our customers, that we, for lack of a better term, we're kind of like the police, the cost police. I think that the development team used that term on me a couple of times. Because like we're tracking them down, right? Say, hey, why are you spinning up a really hefty SQL database in development, right? And if they can't justify that, then they need to basically scale it down. Now, if they can justify that, that's fine, that's great. But that's our job, is to help them kind of control that cost.
Okay, so that makes sense. So summary on this, you've literally got somebody watching dashboards on a daily basis, at least checking on them once a day, and then you're potentially activating an alert notification for significant deltas in cost as another best practice recommendation, right?
Correct. Yeah, because like these dashboards, I mean, basically it takes you less than a minute to look at them, right?
Yeah.
When you look at that, nothing changed, then move on. If there's something changed, then you know right away. So it doesn't take that much time.
Becomes very actionable very quick in a situation like this where you can see that increase. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So we've talked about budget. We talked about cost analysis. What's cost review and why do we care about it?
Yeah. So basically, this is how you begin to track your costs in terms of where you are within the budget, and then also allows you to understand what is being provisioned within your environment. So we talk a little bit about the daily. But typically, we like to do daily, weekly, monthly, and quarterly. It sounds like a lot, but if you add up the time of all these things, you'd probably spend less than 2 or 3 hours a quarter. So, if there's nothing wrong, of course. Now, if there's a lot of things changing, somebody provisioning new stuff, like, hey, somebody just spun up HD Insight, or somebody just launched 10,000 Databricks cores. Yeah, your budget's going to be totally out of whack, right? And so you need to account for that. That's why you need to look at it daily to see if something drastic like that happens, and then you make adjustment.
Okay, now that makes sense. So talk us through, give us details on what's involved in a daily check.
Yeah, so basically, like I said, we just show you that, that daily cost. It's a 1-minute review of the cost management dashboard. So I like, in the morning when I log into my laptop, that's the first thing I see, right? Basically, I bring up the dashboard, look through all of that dashboard to see, hey, my daily costs, all of them are the same. Is there any spike? No spike, I'm done. So that's basically is, like I said, it's less than a minute of review. So it doesn't take that much time.
Okay, makes sense. And this could also, oh, go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, it's the same thing I do every day. When I check on my bank account, I check on my credit card, and so I do that same thing. Every morning I look at it and see what we have.
And this is something that if a customer is doing this themselves, they could integrate this just into their regular routines. I mean, we at Catapult have one guy who has a morning dashboard that he goes through and a routine of checks that he goes through and take a look through the entire environment. This would just be another thing to put on that roster, right?
Correct. I mean, basically, you could directly make that to be your homepage, right? When you open up a browser, that's your homepage.
Okay, now that makes a lot of sense. Now let's get into the bigger. So what about weekly? So what are we covering on a weekly perspective?
Yeah, so on the weekly basis, basically is typically as part of the IT operational meeting, a similar status meeting. You really do need to review your costs and weekly trending. Look at your budget versus your actual costs, identify an anomaly, or any expected changes going to come next week. You kind of praise the team that's maintained the budget, and you call a team that are not, kind of thing. And so, yeah, this is basically take about 5 minutes within that meeting, because you put up your dashboard and it says, hey, everything's going good, or nope, we see these anomalies. We're able to drill down, to identify the resource groups, and we identify the team. What's going on, guys? Why it says spike? So that's basically is what we're talking about. And so,
Okay, so
again, 5 minutes, not a long drawn out process.
Okay, so a quick look at what's going on, calling out specifics of teams that are doing very well, praise and griefing those that are potentially not maintaining with a little bit of public shaming. I get it. So luckily, I don't think I've been public shamed by you yet on that, at least in terms of our own usage, for which I appreciate. So that may have just been you being nice.
We have some customers where they literally publish the dashboard as in the hallway, so they actually put out in the company hallway the costs, right? And suddenly we see right away development, some of the DevOps team, some of the business unit really begin to track their costs, right? Why? Because suddenly they look bad in front of the organization, right? So you have a company with about 10 equal business unit, and one business unit account for 60-70% of the Azure spend. And suddenly the rest of them start asking questions, right? Why are you guys spending so much? And so suddenly, it's kind of like, it's lack of a better term, but basically it's kind of like wall of shame kind of thing. So the goal would be basically is that as you make that information available to the organization, people would change their behavior. In the end, it's not like their fault, right? Like what I find that is a lot of the team that's spending a lot of money is because they don't have an available dashboard. They don't understand how much they're spending. All they're doing is they're doing the job, right? Hey, I'm going to try to test out this thing. I'm going to spin up some Cosmo DB to do evaluation. But if they actually have basically the dashboard to let them know that here's what the cost is of what you just did, it really does help drive the cost management aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, as an example, I could really see a good SquaredUp dashboard on this one where you kind of gamify this towards each of the different teams and see if you can get them to, pressure them through gamification to a degree to keep their costs down. So I could see a cool play out of that.
Yep.
All right, so what do we do monthly then? So if we did our dailies and our weeklies, what's a monthly look like?
Right. So monthly basically is this is where you start looking to spend a little bit more time to begin to track down the costs. And this is the way you also track down basically some of your goal and objective for the month or the quarter. So as you begin to define those goal and objective, this is where you begin to review them. And then on a monthly basis, you need to look at and see, do you need to make adjustments to your budget, right? So let's say, hey, business unit so-and-so just basically spun up a Databricks cluster, right? This is, with an AKS cluster with a bunch of Databricks behind it, machine learning, ML ops. That's going to cost us another $10,000 a month, right? And so that's something like that coming through. You need to make sure that the organization's aware of that. So this meeting is a little bit more robust. And so this is typically, I would say, about 15-minute type of meeting. And then the goal would be basically is to, we need to make adjustment And then also typically we do is we also pull up the top 10 cost item for the team to kind of look and review quickly. And so typically we also involve some of the business unit in this meeting, just because that's ultimately who's paying for the bills, right? Is the business.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then let's jump to quarterly. So we've gone through the other rosters. What's left in quarterly?
Right. So quarterly basically is more of a management review meeting. So this is basically where organizations set their goal and objective, prioritization, then consumption budgeting for finance. So this is where typically quarterly you need to let your finance people know what is your commit your annual budget look like, and then quarterly are we tracking on that or not, right? So the goal would be you don't want to wait till the end of the year and let them go back to your CFO and say we told you we're going to spend $100,000 in Azure. Yeah, we just blown all that already, so we need another $50,000. And so if the CFO wasn't budgeting for that already, you're gonna have a long conversation, right? So we're seeing that type of conversation with some of our customers, and there's not an easy conversation to go back to the CFO and ask for more money. And then also this is where you make decisions about reservation, retention policy, some of the Azure commit. The goal is basically if you are willing to make more commit or reservation, you can save money. But that would be an organization commitment, right? So, hey, you're going to commit to buy this particular VM type of CPU for 3 years. Make sure the organization agree with that. And then the big one typically on quarterly is any architecture changes for cost saving as needed, right? So, a good example would be, hey, Microsoft's coming out with, V3 of certain services. And typically what we see when Microsoft, basically roll out a new version of something, they actually offer you a little bit cost saving. Hey, I'll shave off 5% of the cost if you move to V3 versus staying on V1 or V2. And so by moving up to the new version of stuff, you get better performance, and typically you also get some cost saving. And the reason why Microsoft does that is they want you to get off the old stuff so they can be tied, right? So you're still running on some of the old VM size. Well, they need to replace the CPU right? Eventually with a new one. And so they give you incentives to get off of it, basically. So we have customers who run literally on the same platform for like 5 years. And when we actually move them to all the new stuff, we shave almost 10% off of their total bill, right? And then they actually we got better performance also.
That makes good sense. So it's good to know. So sometimes you can save money by going to the latest and greatest. And also you can also sometimes save money by changing regions, right? Because there are different pricings between regions at times.
Yeah, so it's kind of weird because sometimes certain region does have more costs. We see variation anywhere between a couple of percentage to up to almost 10 to 12%. If I spin up this VM in this region, I actually save money. Now some company may not be able to do that because they have certain restriction, but some company are free, they're free to do as needed. We can spin up basically different area to save money.
That makes sense. All right, so give us the final dashboarding pieces. Why is this important? What do we contain?
Yeah, so that's the key piece of how to do this simple is that build all your dashboard. Again, the dashboard is not that hard to build. You're talking about spending a day or two at most to build out all these dashboards and pin them. The goal basically is again, having that as dashboard to allow you conversation for your meetings, and also having that daily check. So again, the dashboard as your homepage, open your browser, spend a minute on it, and then you're done. And then now you do also have an option to do the cost management Power BI apps if you are EA. So we're seeing a lot of our customers use that option also, and that gives you a lot more insight than some of the dashboard, the Azure out-of-the-box dashboard. But typically we recommend just using the Azure dashboard as an operational tool. And now if you want to do full cost management, reporting, all that stuff, typically Power BI and those type of reporting tool is better. But from operation point of view, the Azure dashboard or something like SquaredUp would really work well.
Yep, no, that makes good sense. So we have a little thing on the cost review dashboard here really quick. Let's just go through this really fast in terms of how you go about it, Tony.
Yeah, so basically you look at what your dashboard is, so you basically create a dashboard, say my cost or something like that. You go to the cost management area. Once you basically set your filter, say, hey, I want to have a monthly cost for this particular area, you then pin it. And then typically we built a bunch of these things and then pin them to the same dashboard. That way I have basically, monthly costs, daily costs, the last 3 months, this quarter, this year, and then also, to a particular resource group I want to monitor, all in one dashboard. So the process, like I said, is really simple, right? You can actually build one of these in less than 5 minutes. And like I said, to build out the whole dashboard to give you everything, typically take about a day.
Okay, now that makes sense. And your thoughts on daily dashboard or daily cost dashboards? It's, daily costs don't lie, right?
Yep. And so you ask people, did you spin up something? More likely they said no. Did you change something? They said no, right? And then the next day we look at it and go, yes, you did. And this is what happened. And they go, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you that we spun that up. Oh, I didn't know it's going to cost that much, right? Stuff like that is basically why you need to have a daily dashboard, because that's the conversation you need to basically track down quickly. If you notice something, ask them, correct. If there's something that was not meant to be, correct it. You don't want to wait till end of the month and get a bill, right? So we have a customer who, a developer, spun up a G series, which is Godzilla series VM. Basically, it's like 32 core, just because he wanted to see how fast his code can compile, just playing around, right? And he left it running for a couple of weeks. And so, end of the month, his boss got an extra bill of what, $3,000 or $4,000 for that VM in development. And so it's like, oh, because why? Nobody was looking at it, right? Nobody was keeping track of this particular dashboard. Because if somebody looked at it, you will see a spike right away. With that spike, then you can track down and say, okay, are you using the VM? Why are you using the VM? And then the developer guy, oh, I was going to just do it for like, an hour. I forgot to turn it off. And so basically correct your cost problem before they become an issue.
That makes sense. All right, so we've gone through the first 3 items, and now the fourth one is our cost planning piece of this. So what happens within cost planning? What do we got here, man?
All right, so it really comes down to basically changes to service or purchasing of new resources and things. It really you want to plan for that, right? It's kind of the same thing, right? Hey, you're going to go buy a car. Well, you make sure you plan your budget for that, right? Make sure you have the money for down payment. Make sure you have the cost for insurance, the cost for maintenance. And so same thing with Azure, right? You want to know, hey, I'm going to spin up this particular service, this type of workload. You want them to, you want the dev team or the DevOps team to line item everything. Don't forget you also have dev, QA, and staging, and we have production potentially. And then also look at your infrastructure costs, right? So like I said, you buy a car, make sure you have to change your oil. But infrastructure costs also like bandwidth, storage, backup, licensing costs, IP, certificates. Those things add up pretty quickly, right? A lot of development teams say, oh, I just need a VM. Well, yeah, great, but then I got to back it up, right? That's going to cost me $15. I got to buy the Azure Defender license to put security on that. But that's another $15 a month. Oh, you want a couple public IP, that's $5 a month. And so you add all this stuff up and you want 2 terabytes of disk space. Okay, so next thing you know, the VM that was supposed to be a couple $100 now become $500 to $600. And so that's the key piece, is that make sure you kind of account for what you're about to purchase and then adjust your budget accordingly.
And you can use something like this, like the price calculator, to give you kind of a ballpark. I mean, if you don't have a history for an item, is this what you're using in essence to try to figure out, hey, what should this cost?
Yeah, so this is basically, it's a great tool. It can get complex, so you might want to play around with it just to get a good understanding of it. But yeah, so that's basically is where we typically start, is that we add in all the stuff that you need, and then basically, the calculator tells you, hey, based on that, we expect you guys to spend about $1,200 a month or something.
Okay. This can do more complicated scenarios as well?
Yeah, so this is basically, this is more, hey, I want to have a solution, right? So somebody comes to us and says, hey, I want to spin up a big data solution. And so we then basically kind of work with them, build in all the components. So what do you need? You need a data factory. You're running data brick. You need some storage, some landing zone. You need some Power BI reporting. So you guys add up basically what is that solution. And then based on that, you can then look at the cost of that solution. So that's usually is kind of more challenging, but it's also give you a much better view of basically what the cost truly going to be within that range.
Yep, And that's, I mean, obviously it's better to have a good idea ahead of time versus just spinning it up and then following it on a daily basis and tracking, what the estimate's going to be.
That, and also make sure the business understand, what the commitment is, right? So,
Yep.
You analyze this and says, hey, business, you guys love that, you want that solution, great. That solution going to cost the company an extra $10,000 a month. Is that valuable to you or not? And some people say, oh yeah, this is needed, and they go, oh really? Well, we just want to have some data for, report that's nice to have, but at a $10,000 a month, that's $120,000 a year, they may not want to spend that. So that's the goal: make sure that the organization understands that true cost, and then have them agree to it, because more likely you're going to have to update your budget number.
All right, so our fifth and final section on this today is related to goals and objectives.
Right.
So we've talked through a lot of pieces. How's this different, and what are we doing here?
Right. So this is basically where you begin to optimize, right? Now, this whole section can be broken down to a whole session by itself. But in general, basically what you're talking about, you want to set clear incremental objective to achieve your overall goal. Small achievable objective, that's the key. We find out, like, hey, customer says that, hey, I want to reduce my overall cost by 40%. That's not realistic, right? Where you even start? And so what we find is, let's pick a very small thing, very an incremental thing that can be achieved very quickly. And so let's go to the example next.
All right, so if we were going to translate this one to a budget, as an example, how do we decrease our amount that we're spending on eating out less for lunch or dinner or something of that nature? That's a rough parallel to what you're talking about here on the Azure Finance side of things, right? Just picking a specific goal.
Yeah. So you think about it, hey, I've been spending a lot of money on lunch. I'm going to go ahead and try to save $100 a month this month. So that basically is a very achievable goal, very tangible, clear objective. So you want to do the exact same thing with your Azure Finance, right? So a good goal we typically work with our customers start with is basically is talking the storage costs, right? So if we look at, analyze this, the environment storage costs is, in the top 2 or 3 category, then we want to have something basic, right? Goal is to save 10% on storage costs this month. What I mean basically is that, I look at it and say, hey, do I really need premium SDD? Can I get away with some of the standard SDD? Can I get away with the standard HDD? Which is the low end. This space, the cost is tremendously different, right? Some people, like, hey, maybe I should be using premium SSD in development, or worse is that, I shouldn't be using, ultra SSD. And so the price tag are significantly different between those categorization. A good example also is like, like the SQL database, right? A VM running SQL. Yeah, you kind of want the premium stuff for your data file, your temp DBs, and so forth. But on your backup drive, which usually what we find is the biggest drive on a SQL, right? Because you want to keep backup for months, if not years. You don't need the premium SSD. You can actually get away with the standard HDD. So 2 terabyte difference could basically shave a couple $100 a month off of the VM, just for that, right? And also look at it, turn on the storage life cycle. Cold storage is for our archiving. And so what we find a lot of our customers who's been in the cloud for a while, like, you haven't touched this storage area for 5-6 years. Why couldn't we put it into cold storage? And they go, oh, okay, we didn't think about it because storage was so cheap back. Yeah, it is cheap, but when you start getting into the terabyte range, it does get pretty expensive keeping it hot. And also, like, reduce disk size if not used, right? That's the thing though. It's like, hey, we think we need 2 terabyte. Great, 2 terabyte maybe a year or 2 from now. Why would you allocate 2 terabyte now if your database size is only 300 or 400 gig? So the goal basically is make sure you right size the disk, because the beauty of this is that you can always grow it. It's very fast. It basically take us about, our team, they got good at doing that. They actually can resize a VM in about 5 minutes. So the goal is then kind of pay for it now, and let's save the thing. By doing all that stuff, you basically more likely shave 10% or more of your storage costs for that month. And so that's the goal, is tackle little things like that, right?
No, that makes good sense. So give me kind of a wrap up on our cost management. What's the key points as takeaways here, Tony, that we've got here?
Yeah. So the key is it's an ongoing process, right? So you have to be disciplined enough to do that. It's a deliberate process, right? There got to be rhythm. There got to be checkpoint. It's very valuable to the organization, right? Like a good example, one of our customers, when we took over, they were spending about $22,000 a month in Azure. Within, I would say, 3-4 months, we actually dropped that down to about $13,000, $14,000 a month. And then we're able to maintain that. And you think about it from that point of view, same workloads running in the cloud, there's no performance issue. But I just say basically $8,000 a month, $96,000 a year, that IT can spend that money with something else. And so that was significant to the customer. And again, the goal is align cloud spend to value to the organization. That's the key piece.
Yep, that makes absolutely good sense. Thank you, Tony. So let me go ahead and just throw this out for a second. That there's a couple of good links here. And Tony, there was a slide before this on 321 workshops. Do you want me to come back to that one? Okay, all right. So a couple quick things here. So first and foremost, if there's something here that you feel like we could potentially help you out with, our team's glad to do so. The link here on our Azure Management Services, and of course, if you're not already taking a look at the SquaredUp for Azure, I've included a link for theirs as well, so that there are great tools out there to make this a lot easier. Not only stuff that's built into Azure, but also stuff that the third-party community has added into the mix. And with that, let me go ahead and hand it back, or actually, we'll leave Q&A for a bit, and then I'll hand it back on our other. So, can we see if we've got any active Q&A at this point in time? Any things people want to know about?
Yes, we do actually. So there are a couple, but I think you have managed to answer them in the flow of your presentation anyway. But I'll just read them out if anybody has missed it. So the first one is, what do you suggest about scalable resources? So I think they mean like virtual machine scale sets or burstable VMs, or so the cost that is sporadic, it is not not expected.
Yeah, so
Tony, that's all you, man.
Yeah, so for scaling like that, basically is that you want to understand how your system will behave, right? And so typically we budget for the high side, because if you go below budget, everybody's happy. If you go over budget, nobody's happy, right? And so I would basically budget, say, hey, if I have a VM scale set of, let's say 5, right? And then my expectation is that I'll run 2, and then I'll scale up to 5 when need to. And so from my point of view, I would budget around 4 VMs then. So that's basically is where I would kind of budget and kind of a little bit on the high side. I mean, I wouldn't. The assumption you're not going to be in maximum all the time. If you are, then you just basically run 5 and not worry about scaling it.
Right. Okay, so you're saying that the actual cost management doesn't have to align exactly with the budget line. It just has to be hugging it a little bit, right?
Well, the goal is the budget line should account for that. So that's the goal. Basically, is that we have to have let's say we typically budget for VM scaling, anything scaling. We basically says what's the maximum. We take 80% of that, and that would be our budget number. And so that way, typically we see that to be the it's well aligned. Because typically most still scaling won't run at 100%. So the budget should be able to absorb that.
All right, perfect. And the other one we have is, how do you figure out whether a resource justifies its cost? So I think you gave an example of like, you're using SSDs. Do you really need to use SSDs? So how do you make that decision as to whether you want to downgrade or whether you want to combine resources?
Yeah, so you look at all Azure resources. This is great. Now there's also metrics, right? So you look at if I start looking at disk space, look at your IOPS number, right? So basically a certain IOPS the disk is supported based upon the type, right? So SSD, premium SSDs have some IOPS capability. Standard SSD has some IOPS capability. Same thing with the Ultra and the standard HDD. So you basically look at your last month of operations, last 30 days. Look at your IOPS number, right? So hey, where are they? Are they hitting maximum IOPS? Because if they are, then you probably more likely have to scale up, right? Because you don't have the bandwidth for that. But typically what we're seeing is that you're running at basically 20% IOPS. So therefore, you really don't need the premium stuff. You probably get away with standard stuff. Similarly with VM, right? So typically for VM, I look at two things, right? CPU and memory. So the the VM Insight, VM Monitor give you that information. So I look at basically the last 30 days. Hey, you're running at maximum 20%. I'm going to scale you down, right? But to make sure basically you have enough memory, and so so those two decisions would allow us to basically scale it down enough. And then also you start using like some of the like QA and stuff. We actually use like the B series because typically most of the time it's sitting idle anyway. So basically when it's idle, you build credit, and then when it runs, you can actually use the credit to run hot. So there's there's a lot of little trick like that. But the goal is basically look at the last 30 days. What does it do? That's the key.
And Tony, you're approaching that conversation very much from a micro perspective of individual pieces of a service in essence, but there's a bigger answer to that when it comes to a full up service. So a service that's providing a benefit to a company that has to also be justified in some way, shape, or form. So as an example, the one that I was responsible for, costing a certain amount per month, ours had to be directly tied to how much revenue we were generating as a result of that overall cost in essence. So what's our percentage that it's costing us to run the service versus the revenue that's being generated for the service. Do you find similar type situations with this with business services, or how are customers approaching that larger scale question of, is this workload worth this much money?
So a good example would be like I have a customer who run basically 20, 30 VMs for e-commerce site, right? The challenge for them basically is the ability to scale up and scale down, all that stuff. And so I think it's very challenging in terms of figuring out how to manage that. But what our approach was basically is let's look at, what's your normal operation, right? And so we actually look at the historical data in terms of business operation, and we find out basically it's very cyclical, right? There's certain event within the end of the year and certain time of the year where they need that scaling up, and so we actually basically rebuild basically a baseline set, and the baseline allows us to say, hey, this is your low period. Let's go ahead and reboot the system into a low configuration. And then as we begin to, get into the, certain event or certain time of the year, we actually reboot the system to a higher scale up model. So that allows them to basically maximize their operation. So we typically like to run things hot, right? Well, what I mean basically is that I like to run things from 80% capacity. In other words, if I have a VM, I like to run the CPU on a 70 to 80%. And that gives me basically the maximum value to the organization. And so the goal is not to have something running 20, 30%. It's really running a high. And so to do that, typically, you're talking about that require a lot more planning because now you're talking about server farm, not just a single server. But there are ways of managing it.
Okay.
Right, perfect. Thanks. So actually, just to add on that, so this is exactly what we were wondering here at SquaredUp is like the same question. How do you figure out whether a resource justifies its cost, right? So we also have a mechanism to do that. So like you said, the cost has to be always measured against its performance, right? So whether a CPU is being utilized at its most or not, whether for an SSD or HDD for a disk, is the IOPS on the right side of the scale or not? So all of these things, we have actually a visualization that ties these together. Cameron, can you go back to the slide that you have SquaredUp dashboard on? I think that was the one.
We had 2 or 3 SquaredUp dashboards in here. 1 second. They were subsets of the same. This one in particular, the cost analysis dashboard. We'll see. You can see that here in just a second.
I think the one on the next page.
Okay, cost by resource.
The tree map thing, yes.
Yeah, tree maps. Okay.
Right. So yeah. So this one's actually a performance utilization tile. So what this tells you is, so the color of this is tied to the, I think the color or size of the box is tied to cost, and the other thing is cost is tied to the performance metric. Right. So you can have a dashboard where you have a utilization map, and you will be able to tie them together in the same dashboard. So you will be able to see how much it is costing at the same time how much the metric is being used on that particular machine, right? So you can make that decision right here from the dashboard.
Oh, cool.
So in this case, the coloration, it looks like, are indicating utilization. So either from a very light blue to a very dark blue based upon that metric, it looks like.
Exactly. So it will. So if you have got like big light colored boxes, that probably means that you're spending a lot but not using it as much, right? So you can identify your cost right then and there.
Okay, excellent. But we are almost out of time. Let me go ahead and move us to our last slide where you can kind of help us through, you know, what's next up in the series, who's talking and what are they talking about?
Yes, so excuse me. So this was just the first in the series of our talks. So the next one will be presented by Martin Ernst on Thursday, 11th of February, in which is it's going to be about multi-tenant resource management at scale using Azure Lighthouse, I believe. So I hope everyone on this call will also be on that next call. Well, so I think that's it. So let's wrap it up for today. Thanks, Tony and Cameron, for taking the time.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. So the recording of this meeting will be shared and published, I think, by early next week. So just watch out for that.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining and have a nice day.
Thanks all.
Cheers. Bye.